The cops weren't mad. They weren't even disappointed. They were just confused and wet. Mostly confused. To be fair, I don't think Police Academy has a training module for domestic disturbance involving decommissioned municipal firefighting apparatus. As Officer Miller, a man whose face was a permanent monument to exhaustion, pinched the bridge of his nose, leaving a damp spot, his rookie partner Davis just stared at the 40,000-pound bright red behemoth parked in my driveway. "So," Officer Miller said, his voice gravelly with the kind of weariness you only earn after 20 years of dealing with suburbia's weirdest. "Let me get this straight. You are telling me this is landscaping." I stood on the top deck of my 1994 Pierce Arrow pumper, rainwater and pride dripping from my face in equal measure. I gave him my most earnest, responsible citizen smile. "High-efficiency irrigation, officer. I'm conserving water." But to understand the sight of two of suburbia's finest getting misted by the runoff from my lawn, a lawn that now had the consistency of a World War I battlefield, you have to go back 3 weeks, to a time before the diesel fumes and the deafening roar of a pump designed to fight chemical fires. A time when my biggest problem was a gentle tsh-tsh-tsh sound in the dead of night. It all started with my lawn. My name is Alex, and I am a lawn man. Not in a professional sense. I sit at a computer all day designing websites, which is about as far from manual labor as you can get. But in a spiritual sense, I am a tiller of the earth, a cultivator of blades, a suburban druid. My lawn wasn't just grass. It was a verdant tapestry of Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass, meticulously cared for, perfectly edged, and uniformly lush. It was my sanctuary, the one part of my life where I had complete, beautiful control. Unfortunately, I live in California, and in California, having a perfect lawn is like having a pet unicorn, beautiful, magical, and morally questionable to the general public. We were in the middle of a historic drought, and the state had handed down water restrictions stricter than the rules at a monastery. You could only water your lawn between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. The logic was sound. Less sun means less evaporation. So, being the law-abiding, civic-minded guy I am, I programmed my sprinkler system for a 30-minute cycle at 10 p.m. sharp. For a week, all was right with the world. My lawn stayed green, the water police stayed away, and the delicate suburban ecosystem remained in balance. Then came the knock. It was 10:05 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was watching a documentary about deep-sea fish contemplating the eternal darkness of the abyssal plain, when a sharp, insistent rapping echoed through the house. I opened the door to a woman who looked like her entire skeleton was made of disapproval. She was maybe in her late 50s, wearing a pastel pink tracksuit that screamed both leisure and judgment. Her name was Brenda, and her spiritual animal was a homeowners association violation notice. "Hi, Alex," she said, her smile as thin and tight as a banjo string. "It's a little late, isn't it?" My brain cycled through the possibilities. For what? A midnight seance? Debating the merits of unpasteurized cheese? Starting a Journey cover band? For the city-mandated watering schedule? Nope, right on time, I said cheerfully. Her smile twitched. For that noise, she clarified, gesturing vaguely toward my front yard, where the sprinklers were emitting their gentle, rhythmic hiss. The tsh-tsh. Some of us are trying to sleep. I blinked. I could hear crickets chirping louder than my sprinklers. A car 2 blocks over had a bass-heavy stereo that was rattling the fillings in my teeth. But my sprinklers were the problem. Brenda, they're not that loud, and I have to water at night. It's the law. It's also the law, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. To be considerate of your neighbors. The HOA Charter, Section 4, Paragraph C, explicitly forbids nuisance abatement, and that hissing is a nuisance. I was about to argue the legal definition of abatement, but I saw the look in her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated purpose. This was her Super Bowl. I was a reasonable man. I wanted peace in my kingdom. So I sighed. Okay, Brenda, how about this? I'll push the cycle back. I'll set it for 11 p.m. That should give you plenty of time to fall asleep. She considered this, her head tilting. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of human reason. Very well, she said finally, as if ratifying a peace treaty. Thank you for being so compliant. She turned and marched back to her beige-colored house, a soldier of suburban order. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I had averted a crisis. I had been a good neighbor. I had compromised. I had just made my first mistake. I had negotiated with a terrorist. A week of blissful 11 p.m. watering passed. I'd check my security camera feed each night, watching the gentle spray nourish my lawn, feeling a sense of paternal pride. The crickets chirped, the neighborhood slept, and my grass grew 0.5 millimeter taller, basking in the moonlight and recycled water. I had won. Then came the second knock. This time it was 11:05 p.m. on a Wednesday. The knock was harder, more impatient. I opened the door. It was Brenda, again in a tracksuit, this one a shade of mint green that was an offense to nature itself. "Alex," she said, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantry. "Brenda," I replied, matching her tone. "Everything okay?" "No, everything is not okay," she snapped. "It's that noise again, the hissing. It's incessant." I stared at her. "Brenda, we had this conversation. I moved the time like you asked. It's 11 p.m. now." "And I appreciate that," she said, though her face said the exact opposite. "But my Prince Fluffybutt III cannot get to sleep. He's a very sensitive toy poodle, and the sound grates on his nerves." I waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. She was dead serious. Her poodle, a creature that looked like a cotton ball with anxiety, was the arbiter of nocturnal peace on our block. "He has a delicate disposition," she added, as if that explained everything. "Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "It's the quietest sprinkler system on the market. I can't make it any quieter. This is the sound of water. Moving. It's physics. I can't do anything about it." "Well," she huffed, "the HOA will hear about this." She spun on her heel and stomped off. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It was on thick, cream-colored cardstock with the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association logo embossed at the top. It looked more official than my college diploma. In stark, laser-printed letters, it detailed a formal complaint filed by a concerned neighbor regarding a violation of Section 4, Paragraph C. At the bottom was the kicker: "A fine of $50 has been assessed to your property for excessive nocturnal auditory disturbance." I called my best friend Dave. Dave is a lawyer, which sounds helpful until you realize he specializes in corporate tax law, and his legal advice for everything else is sourced from episodes of Better Call Saul. "You got fined $50 for watering your lawn?" he cackled over the phone. "Dude, you're living in a sitcom." "It's not funny, man. She said it was bothering her poodle. Her poodle, Dave." "Okay, so you have 2 options," he said, the glee evident in his voice. 1, you stop watering your lawn, let it die, and admit defeat. Brenda wins, your property value plummets, and you live in shame. 2, he paused for dramatic effect, and hear me out, you install a commercial-grade soundproofing wall along your entire property line. I know a guy. It'll only cost you like 30 grand. Think of the peace and quiet. Or, I said, ignoring him, Option 3. I find a quieter way to water. That weekend, I became a man possessed. I went to the hardware superstore and spent an obscene amount of money on a top-of-the-line, whisper-quiet, subterranean drip irrigation system. It took me 2 full days of digging trenches, laying tubing, and connecting dozens of tiny little emitters. My back screamed, my hands were blistered, but when I was done, I had a system that was technologically miraculous. It delivered water directly to the roots of the grass with no spray, no mist, and, most importantly, no sound. It was completely, utterly silent. I stood on my porch that Sunday evening, a king surveying his silent, well-hydrated domain. I was victorious. On Tuesday morning, there was another cream-colored envelope in my mailbox. My stomach dropped. I tore it open. It was another violation notice. This time the complaint was twofold. First, Brenda was complaining about the faint, maddening dripping sound if she stood right next to the property line and held her breath. Second, and this is the part where my brain started to short-circuit, she had filed a complaint about the unnatural wetness pattern the drip system left on the lawn in the morning. It was, and I quote, visually disruptive to the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. The fine was now $100. I stood there, in the middle of my driveway, holding the letter. I had followed the law. I had compromised. I had spent a weekend of my life and a significant amount of money to appease this woman and her neurotic dog. And my reward was another fine for my lawn being wet in a way she didn't like. Something inside me snapped. A tiny, rational part of my brain that had been pleading for peace and quiet was gagged, tied up, and thrown into the trunk of a much larger, much more creative part of my brain. This was no longer about noise. It was no longer about Prince Fluffybutt III. This was about control. Brenda's problem wasn't the sound, it was the duration. She hated that for 30 minutes every night, something was happening that she couldn't police. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. She wanted the duration to be shorter? Fine, I'd make it shorter. She hadn't just declared war on my sprinklers. She had declared war on physics, on logic, on reason itself. And I was about to return fire with overwhelming force. That night, sleep was a distant country I had no visa for. Fueled by a potent cocktail of righteous indignation and 3 cups of dangerously strong coffee, I sat in the glow of my monitor, descending into the depths of the internet. My search history from that night would look like a madman's manifesto. Fastest way to water a lawn. Industrial irrigation systems. How much water in a fire hose? Agricultural water cannon for sale. Can a civilian own a tank? Okay, that last one was a brief detour. But my mind was working on a different kind of heavy artillery. I was looking for a solution that was so big, so absurd, so undeniably final that it would blast through the brick wall of Brenda's petty tyranny. Then, I found it. I stumbled upon GSA Auctions, the U.S. government's official surplus website. It was a magical place, a garage sale for Uncle Sam. You could buy anything from a pallet of used office chairs to a decommissioned Coast Guard vessel. I scrolled past old police interceptors, filing cabinets, and portable generators, and then, under the trucks and other vehicles category, I saw it. Lot hash 734, 1994 Pierce Arrow pumper fire truck. It was beautiful. It was magnificently, absurdly red. It had chrome railings, a massive pump panel with more gauges and levers than a 747 cockpit, and a huge water cannon mounted on top. The description was simple. Mileage 54,218. Engine Detroit diesel. Condition runs. Pump operational. Tires fair. And the price? The current bid was a shockingly reasonable $4,500. I started laughing. A low chuckle at first, then a full-blown maniacal cackle that probably had my wife, Sarah, thinking I'd finally lost it. It was a joke. A hilarious, insane joke. I took a screenshot and texted it to Dave. Me, new sprinkler system? Dave. Dave. Dude. Dave. Dave, you wouldn't. But the seed was planted. And it was being watered by the pure undiluted spite I felt for Brenda and her aesthetically cohesive poodle. My brain, now fully in problem-solving mode, began to rationalize it. It was a symphony of beautiful, flawed logic. Point 1. It's not about being loud, it's about being efficient. Brenda's core complaint, when you boiled away all the nonsense, was the duration of the noise. 30 minutes was a nuisance. But what if I could do the entire job in 60 seconds? 1 minute of glorious, overwhelming noise and then silence. It was the epitome of consideration. Point 2. It's technically compliant. I scoured the HOA charter. There were rules against commercial vehicles being parked overnight, but this wasn't a commercial vehicle. It was my personal irrigation equipment. There were rules about noise, but they pertained to sustained noise. A 1-minute burst was an event, not a nuisance. Point 3. Unparalleled performance. Think of the water pressure. My lawn would be the most hydrated, most robustly green lawn in the entire state. It would be a testament to horticultural excellence. Point 4. It would be hilarious. This was, admittedly, the main driver. The next evening, I broached the subject with Sarah. I chose my moment carefully, waiting until she was relaxed, glass of wine in hand. "Honey," I began, my voice smooth and casual. "You know how I've been having that issue with Brenda and the sprinklers? The one where you're feuding with a woman who communicates exclusively through passive-aggressive notes and formal complaints?" "Vaguely," she said, not looking up from her book. "Well, I've found a permanent solution, one that is both efficient and, in its own way, a bold statement about personal property rights." I showed her the picture on my phone. She stared at it. Her expression went from mild curiosity to confusion, then to a slow-dawning horror. "Alex," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you are not buying a fire truck." "It's an investment in domestic tranquility," I argued. "It solves the problem completely, 1 minute and it's done." "It's a 40,000-pound cry for help is what it is. Where would you even park it? What would the neighbors say? Alex, this is insane." "Geniuses are often called insane before their time," I said sagely. She just shook her head and went back to her book. "Don't you dare, Alex." Her prohibition hung in the air. But the next morning, another cream-colored envelope was waiting for me. This time, the fine was $200 for unapproved landscape modifications related to the installation of the silent, invisible drip irrigation system. That was it. That was the final push I needed. I went to my computer, logged into the GSA auction site, and looked at lot hash 734. The bid was still low. My heart hammered in my chest. My hands trembled as I typed in my bid, $5,250. I clicked confirm. I immediately felt a wave of buyer's remorse. What was I doing? Sarah was right, it was insane. I put it out of my mind, assuming I'd be outbid by some rural fire department or a collector. A week passed. I heard nothing. The auction closing date came and went. I began to relax, figuring someone else had won the big red beast. Then, on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you are the winning bidder." I opened it. "Congratulations, you are the winning bidder for lot, hash 734, 1994 Pierce Pumper. Please arrange for payment and pickup within 10 business days." I stared at the screen, a tidal wave of emotions washing over me. Terror, regret, excitement, and a surge of pure, unadulterated, triumphant glee. "Oh my God," I whispered to the empty room. "What have I done?" Winning an online auction for a fire truck is the easy part. The hard part is explaining to the shipping broker that yes, you are a private citizen, and yes, you need a 20-ton vehicle delivered to a residential cul-de-sac. The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. "To Creekwood Estates?" the dispatcher finally asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Sir, my driver needs at least an 80-foot clearance to get the flatbed in and out of there." "He'll have it," I promised, having no earthly idea if that was true. The day of the delivery was a neighborhood event. The flatbed, groaning under the weight of my magnificent red beast, crept down our street like a conquering war machine. It was massive. It blocked the entire road. Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down stopped her power walk to stare, mouth agape. The Johnson kids next door pressed their faces against the window, pointing excitedly. And across the street, in her perfectly manicured garden, stood Brenda. Her face, a mask of pure distilled rage, was slowly turning a shade of crimson that almost matched the truck. The driver, a burly man named Carl with a sweat-stained baseball cap, hopped down from the cab. "All right, where do you want her?" "Right there," I said, pointing to my driveway. Carl chewed on his toothpick and surveyed the scene. "You got a Class B driver's license for that thing?" "Working on it," I lied smoothly. "Right," he said, clearly not believing a word. He expertly unloaded the truck, the flatbed hissing and groaning. With a final, ground-shaking thud, the Pierce pumper was on my property. It was bigger than I remembered. It was bigger than my garage. It was bigger than common sense. It barely fit in the driveway. I had to sacrifice a prize-winning rose bush just to get the back end clear of the sidewalk. Carl had me sign a form, handed me a greasy set of keys, and said, "She's all yours. Good luck." I stood there, keys in hand, staring at my purchase. Now what? The truck was a complex beast of diesel, chrome, and mystery. The pump panel looked like something out of the Apollo program. I knew how to work a sprinkler timer. This was a different league. I needed an expert. I found him on a local forum for retired firefighters. His name was Gus. His profile picture was a blurry photo of a walrus. His post simply said, "Retired fire engineer. Know my way around a pump. Will work for beer." He was perfect. Gus arrived the next day in a beat-up Ford Ranger. He was a man of about 65, with a magnificent mustache and hands like catcher's mitts. He circled the fire truck once, kicked a tire, and grunted. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you bought a fire truck to water your lawn." He didn't ask it like a question. He stated it as a sad, unbelievable fact that the universe had forced him to confront. "For efficiency," I said, a little too brightly. "Right," Gus replied, his face betraying no emotion. "Efficiency. Pop the hood." Over the next week and a half, Gus became my reluctant sensei. Project Hydropocalypse, as I'd mentally dubbed it, was officially underway. Our time together was a series of comical and educational vignettes. First, there was the problem of filling the 500-gallon water tank. My brilliant plan was to use my garden hose. Gus watched me for a solid 10 minutes, the hose dribbling a pathetic stream into the cavernous tank, before he let out a world-weary sigh. "Kid, we'll be here till Christmas." He drove off and returned with a transfer pump and a special wrench. After a quick, legitimate call to the water department to get a temporary hydrant permit, a call that I'm sure made their day, he hooked up the pump to the fire hydrant at the corner of my street. The tank was full in 3 minutes. Brenda, who was documenting the whole thing on her phone from her window, nearly had an aneurysm. Next came the pump test. "We are not doing this here," Gus stated flatly. You'll take out your neighbor's window. We drove the truck, me grinding the gears like a teenager while Gus winced in the passenger seat, to a deserted industrial park on the edge of town. Gus showed me how to engage the power takeoff, the magical gear that diverted the engine's power from the wheels to the pump. The roar was incredible. "All right," he yelled over the noise. "Easy does it. Open that valve there. Just a crack." I grabbed the lever for the deck gun, the big cannon on top, and gave it what I thought was a gentle pull. The resulting blast of water was anything but gentle. A solid, thick column of water erupted from the nozzle with the force of a battering ram, slamming into a dumpster 100 feet away and spinning it around. The recoil nearly threw me from the platform. My heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "I said a crack!" Gus bellowed, but I could see a tiny smile under his mustache. Finally, we had to modify the nozzle. A solid jet of water would drill a new well in my front yard. I needed a fan spray. Gus, who apparently had a fully equipped machine shop in his garage, helped me fabricate a custom brass fitting that would disperse the water in a wendopud, gentle-ish arc. As he worked the lathe, he'd offer pearls of wisdom. "You know," he said, wiping grease from his hands, "usually we use these pumps to put out chemical fires, maybe a 5-alarm blaze downtown. But you know, crabgrass is a menace too, a real threat to the community." By the end of the second week, it was ready. The tank was full. The pump was tested. The custom nozzle was fitted. The diesel engine hummed with menacing potential. As Gus packed up his tools for the last time, he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Son," he said, looking from me to the truck and back again, "you got a problem and you solved it with a bigger, louder, much redder problem. I respect that." He paused. "Just aim away from the house. W-Day. Watering Day. The day of reckoning." For a week, the fire truck had sat dormant in my driveway, a silent, crimson giant. It had become a local landmark. Teenagers took selfies with it. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before would give me a curious thumbs up as they drove by. Brenda, meanwhile, had taken to glaring at it from her window at all hours, as if hoping her sheer force of will could make it rust into oblivion. But tonight it would awaken. The anticipation was killing me. I felt like a general before a major battle, or maybe a mad scientist before flipping the giant switch. I spent the evening pacing, checking the weather, clear skies, minimal wind, and going over the plan in my head. At 10:45 p.m., I began my preparations. I suited up. This wasn't a job for flip-flops and a t-shirt. I donned a pair of heavy-duty rubber boots, a yellow fisherman's raincoat, and safety goggles. I looked ridiculous, like the hapless sidekick in a disaster movie. Sarah watched me from the kitchen doorway, shaking her head slowly. "You're really going through with this," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's for the good of the lawn, honey," I replied, my voice muffled by my zipped-up collar. "Just try not to flood the neighbor's basement, okay?" "No promises." I gave her a quick peck on the cheek and marched out the door, my boots clopping purposefully on the pavement. The night was quiet, still. A perfect suburban evening. For now. I grabbed my phone and sent a final text to Dave. "Me. T-minus 5 minutes to splashdown. The eagle is in the nest." Dave. "Godspeed, you magnificent idiot. Film everything. For legal reasons. And my personal amusement." I climbed into the cab of the truck. The seat groaned under my weight. The air smelled of old vinyl and diesel. I took a deep breath, inserted the key, and turned. The Detroit diesel engine didn't so much start as explode into consciousness. A deep, guttural chug-chug-chug roared to life, and the entire 20-ton vehicle shuddered around me. The ground vibrated. Across the street, Brenda's bedroom light flicked on instantly, like a moth drawn to a flame it despises. 2 houses down, a dog started barking frantically. So much for stealth. Showtime. I flipped the switch to engage the PTO. The engine's roar deepened, joined by a high-pitched mechanical whine as the pump spooled up. The noise was immense, a physical presence that pressed in on me. I climbed out of the cab and clambered up the side of the truck to the top platform, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the handles of the deck gun, the cold metal a shock to my system. My lawn lay before me, a dark, thirsty canvas. I glanced at my watch. 11 p.m. exactly. Taking another steadying breath, I yelled out to the empty, sleeping street, "Clear!" Then, I gripped the main valve lever and pulled it open. The next 60 seconds were a blur of chaos and glory. It wasn't like a sprinkler. It wasn't even like a fire hose. It was like summoning a personal, localized monsoon. A solid wall of water, atomized into a massive fan by Gus's custom nozzle, erupted from the cannon with a deafening whoosh. It arced beautifully under the moonlight, a silver curtain of pure hydration, before descending upon my lawn with the force of a tidal wave. The sound was unbelievable. A roaring, percussive onslaught that drowned out the engine, the dog, everything. The ground shook with the impact. I watched, mesmerized, as my perfectly manicured grass was instantly, totally submerged. Puddles formed, then merged into a shallow lake. Water cascaded off the lawn, turning my driveway into a river that flowed directly into the storm drain at the curb, which gurgled heroically as it tried to keep up. I swept the cannon back and forth once, twice, ensuring total coverage. My prize-winning petunias in the flower bed were flattened into a colorful, watery pulp. A rogue gust of wind sent a sheet of mist drifting across the street, peppering Brenda's front window with droplets. Whoops. My watch beeped. 60 seconds. I slammed the valve shut. The sudden silence was even more stunning than the noise. It was a profound, ringing quiet, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from every leaf, every surface, and the continued, desperate glugging of the storm drain. My lawn was no longer a lawn. It was a swamp, a reflecting pool. But it was, without a shadow of a doubt, watered. I stood atop my metal steed, soaked and triumphant, a modern-day Poseidon of the cul-de-sac. Across the street, Brenda's front door flew open, and in the distance, I heard a faint, familiar sound, growing steadily louder. Woo-ee! Ooh-ee! Sirens! I grinned. Mission accomplished! The sirens grew louder, culminating in the arrival of 2 police cruisers that slicked to a halt at the end of my street, their flashing red and blue lights painting the entire cul-de-sac in a surreal, pulsating glow. The beams danced across the wet houses, the shimmering lake that was once my lawn, and the gleaming red paint of my oversized sprinkler. It looked like a crime scene from a very strange, very damp movie. Officer Miller, the veteran, got out of the first car. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen it all and was profoundly unimpressed by any new additions to the list. His partner, Officer Davis, a kid who looked like he still had to ask his mom to buy his uniforms, got out of the second car, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. Before they could even take a step, Brenda's front door burst open and she stormed out, a force of nature in a silk bathrobe and fuzzy slippers. She had her phone in her hand, held up like she was recording evidence for a war crimes tribunal. "He's a menace!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. I was still perched on top of the fire truck, which I figured was the best vantage point. "A public disturbance. Look at my windows. They're wet. He's trying to wash my house away. Arrest him." Officer Miller ignored her for a moment, his gaze fixed on the scene. He looked at my swamp lawn. He looked at the fire truck. He looked up at me, still dripping. His face was a perfect, unreadable mask of professional stoicism. He finally walked over to the edge of my driveway, careful not to step in the newly formed river. "Evening," he said, his voice flat. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" "Just watering my lawn, officer," I said, projecting my voice as calmly as I could. "City ordinance says I have to do it after 9 p.m. Just trying to be a good citizen." Officer Davis crept up behind Miller, whispering, Is that a real fire truck?" "It appears to be, Davis," Miller murmured back without taking his eyes off me. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it identifies as a very large sprinkler." Brenda was not about to be ignored. She scurried over, holding her phone up to Miller's face. "I have it all on video, the noise, the sheer volume of water. It's a public safety hazard." Miller held up a hand, a silent plea for quiet. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." He turned his attention back to me. "Sir, could you please come down from the vehicle?" I complied, climbing down the ladder with as much dignity as a man in a soggy raincoat could muster. I squished over to the officers, my boots making sucking sounds in the saturated turf. "All right," Miller said, getting out his notepad. "Let's start from the beginning. Your neighbor here says you're causing a disturbance." This was my moment. I calmly and rationally laid out the entire saga. I told him about the water restrictions. I told him about Brenda's first complaint about the tish, touch, tush sound. I told him about my compromise to move the time. I told him about her second complaint regarding Prince Fluffybutt III's delicate nerves. I presented the HOA violation notices for auditory disturbance and visually disruptive wetness patterns. As I spoke, Officer Davis was furiously scribbling notes. Officer Miller, however, just listened, his expression unchanging. "So," Miller said when I was finished, "let me get this straight. You are telling me this." He gestured to the entire scene, the truck, the swamp, my ridiculous outfit, is because she fined you for watering your lawn too quietly. "Essentially, yes," I confirmed. "She complained about the 30-minute duration of the noise, so I found a way to do the same job in 60 seconds. It's far more efficient and represents a 96% reduction in the nuisance period. If anything, I'm being considerate." Miller stared at me for a long moment. I think his brain was trying to reboot. He turned to Davis. "Davis, what ordinances have we got on this?" Davis flipped through his notepad. "Well, sir, the noise ordinance, section 9.04, is for sustained noise between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. A single minute probably doesn't qualify as sustained. There's no city ordinance against private ownership of a decommissioned vehicle as long as it's registered, and there's nothing on the books about, excessive irrigation." Brenda sputtered. But look at it! It's a fire truck!" Miller turned to her. "Ma'am, as far as I can tell, no laws have been broken here tonight." "This is outrageous!" she shrieked. "I'm a taxpayer. My poodle is traumatized." "Your dispute," Miller said, his patience finally wearing thin, "seems to be with your homeowners association, not the city police department. This is a civil matter." He turned back to me. His eyes held a universe of exhaustion. But I saw a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something else in them. Amusement? Respect? "Sir," he said, his voice low, "don't make this a habit, and maybe give your neighbors a heads up next time." "Will do, officer," I said solemnly. He and Davis walked back to their cruisers. I heard Davis say, "So, are you logging this as a suspicious circumstance or—" "We're not logging this at all, Davis," Miller cut him off. "This never happened. My paperwork is complicated enough." They got in their cars and drove away, their flashing lights disappearing down the street. Brenda was left standing in the middle of the road, sputtering in impotent rage, her victory snatched away by the maddening logic of my malicious compliance. I stood on my soggy lawn, the proud captain of a ship that would never see the sea. And I knew I had won the war. The next morning, the sun rose on a new world, or at least a new cul-de-sac. My lawn, having absorbed its biblical deluge, was a vibrant, almost glowing shade of green. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and victory. As I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, the neighborhood slowly came to life, and I realized something had fundamentally shifted. Mr. Henderson, the retired accountant from down the street who I thought hated me, drove by on his way to get the morning paper. He slowed his Buick, rolled down the window, and gave me a slow, deliberate thumbs up before driving off. The Johnson kids next door had their faces pressed to the glass again, but this time they were waving frantically. Even Mrs. Gable, during her power walk, gave me a curt nod that felt like a standing ovation. The story had spread overnight. I wasn't just Alex, the guy with the neat lawn. I was Fireman Alex, the suburban folk hero, the man who fought the HOA and won. Of course, Brenda was not going to take this lying down. By noon, flyers were taped to every lamppost. "Emergency HOA meeting," they screamed in a bold, angry font. "Tonight, 7 p.m. Topic: the regulation of military-grade hardware and public nuisances." I walked into the community clubhouse that evening, expecting to be the guest of honor at my own execution. Brenda was at the front, standing next to a whiteboard, ready to lead the prosecution. But as people filed in, the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't hostile. It was amused. Brenda started the meeting with a fiery 30-minute speech about safety, property values, aesthetic cohesion, and the trauma her poodle had endured. She presented blurry photos of my truck and videos of the deluge. She demanded the board draft an immediate emergency bylaw banning any vehicle over 10,000 pounds that wasn't an RV. When she finished, a tense silence fell over the room. Then, Mr. Henderson stood up. "Brenda," he said, his voice calm and steady, "last month, you fined me $50 because my recycling bin was visible from the street 6 hours before pickup. You called it visual blight." Then Mrs. Gable stood up. "You sent me a formal warning because my holiday wreath was, and I quote, an unapproved shade of crimson." One by one, other neighbors stood up. People I barely knew. They told their own stories of Brenda's reign of terror, fines for kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk, graffiti, fines for garden gnomes, unapproved statuary, fines for having a barbecue on a Tuesday, excessive weeknight revelry. It turned out I hadn't declared war. I had just fired the first shot in a revolution that had been simmering for years. My absurd, over-the-top solution had given everyone else the courage to speak up. The focus of the meeting shifted from my fire truck to Brenda's abuse of power. The board, seeing the tide turn so dramatically, voted to table the military-grade hardware motion indefinitely and instead form a committee to review Brenda's conduct as head of the Architectural Review Board. She sat there, her face pale, as her little empire crumbled around her. In the weeks that followed, life on the cul-de-sac changed. Brenda resigned from the HOA and became a virtual recluse. The neighborhood, meanwhile, embraced its new, quirky identity. My fire truck was no longer a weapon. It was a beloved mascot. That summer, I used it to fill the Johnson kids' massive inflatable pool in about 90 seconds. We hosted a charity car wash, using the truck's pump on a low setting, and raised over $1,000 for the local animal shelter. And once a week, on Wednesday nights at 11 p.m., I would fire up the engine for the 60-second soak. People would come out on their porches to watch. It became a ritual. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, looking at my ridiculously green lawn and the giant red monument to stubbornness parked in my driveway. Sarah came out and handed me a cold beer, sitting down next to me. "You know," she said, a small smile on her face, "I hate to admit it, but that thing has really brought the neighborhood together." "See?" I said, taking a long, satisfying sip. "I told you, an investment in domestic tranquility." I looked over at Brenda's perfectly manicured, yet somehow less vibrant, lawn. Her windows were dark. The silence from her house was more profound than the roar of any engine. Some people just need to learn not to play with fire, or in this case, a whole lot of water.